Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the latest webinar in a series of webinars that IEA-GHG has been producing on its work over the last couple of years and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future. I know a number of you have been online quite promptly, so you will have seen already the IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D Programme slide. Very briefly, we're part of the IEA's Energy Technology Network. We are supported by 32 members from 18 different countries, plus OPEC, EU and the CIAB, which is also a member of the IEA, plus a number of industrial sponsors. Our membership, we are very much a members-focused organisation. Our members set our strategic direction and our technical programme. But it is important to point out that we are a technical-based organisation. We don't attempt to or try to define policy in any of our country members. We leave that to the IEA. We're not advocates for any particular technology, although we do focus a lot of our research on CCS. This webinar today, I'll introduce my colleague shortly, is entitled 1.5 degrees centigrade, meeting the challenges of the Paris Agreement. As we all know, Paris was something of a leapfrog now in terms of global ambitions to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. The CCS was seen as a key component in the IPCC's fifth assessment report that was published just over a year ago now, and it was seen as a key technology to reach 2 degrees centigrade, which was the temperature target prior to COP21. Of course, COP21 increased that ambition. Now we're going to look to go below 2 degrees centigrade, particularly optimistically to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And we interpret that if CCS was important to reach 2, then it's going to be even more important to help mitigate emissions to get to below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And we await the output from the IPCC analyses and IEA's analyses coming up, which will sort of help define that more. We see CCS as both very important in the power sector, but also it probably is the only technology that can significantly mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, particularly CO2 emissions, in heavy industry, and therefore we think it has a particularly high opportunity going forward. So at that point I'll hand over to my colleague. Great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jasmine Kemper, who's now been with us for some 6 years. Jasmine is our go-to for all the challenging, difficult analyses that we do that are somewhat non-technical. She recently produced and presented this paper to our members in our last executive committee meeting, and we thought it'd be very useful for Jasmine to update that and give us her perspective on how we might meet this new challenge, i.e. 1.5 degrees C set by the Paris Agreement. And don't forget, we will be out taking questions afterwards, so if you have any questions, can you please type them as you go along, and we will endeavour to answer as many as we can at the end of the broadcast. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Jasmine.
Yeah, thank you, John, for the kind introduction, and hello everyone to the webinar on 1.5 degrees C, meeting the challenge of the Paris Agreement. And I'm going to give you an overview about what the next approximately half hour will be about. So first we'll have a short introduction about why 1.5 degrees C, and I will talk a bit about the Paris Agreement, about our current emissions, and also about carbon budgets. Then I will give you a short summary and some conclusions from the 1.5 degrees conference, that's the conference that has already taken part last September at the University of Oxford. Then there will be maybe some food for thought on how we might get to 1.5 degrees C, and this will include a bit about negative emission technologies, and in particular about biomass with carbon capture and storage, and about the sustainability issues that are especially related to the biomass component. And finally I will talk about the new and upcoming IPCC special report, about the scope and the timeline, and then I will finish with some overall conclusions. So if you're interested in a more text-based condensed version of this webinar, we have already published an information paper last year, which you can download from our website. And yeah, let's start with the Paris Agreement. At COP21 in Paris in December in 2015, we committed us to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C. And this was behind the knowledge that if we would burn all known fossil fuel reserves unabatedly, we would likely not be able to keep the temperature rise to below 2 degrees. So following on from the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC asked the IPCC to provide a special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees C until the end of 2018. So that's already next year. And the short working title, because the exact working title is quite long, was then SR 1.5. And the IPCC accepted the invitation and the challenge to produce this report. And there's a bit of a discussion going on what exactly below 2 degrees C means. In the Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, it says that we should aim at holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, but also that we shall pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C. So that is why a lot of organizations and people are already kind of shooting in the 1.5 target. However, you could also, of course, enter a discussion whether 1.7 would still be well below 2 degrees C. But yeah, because also the IPCC has asked for a report on 1.5, that seems what is now understood or translated as well below 2 degrees C. So where are we currently? To show you this, I've brought up a climate clock. What does it mean, 2 degrees C versus 1.5 degrees C? This is a project led by Concordia University. And it shows you what global warming we have reached to date, that it's about 1 degree that we have already reached, because we have already emitted quite a lot of CO2. And the researcher in this project, they then calculate how many time have we left until we reach 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C. And from the current calculations, you can see that we only have 16 years left until we would hit 1.5 degrees C, and only about 30 years until we would hit 2 degrees C. So I've provided you the link. You can follow their project if you like. They're updating that clock once a year, where they then take into account all the current research that has been going on and all the new data, feed it into their clock and update the clock. The good thing, compared to the last time I've seen the clock, we have won about 1 year, but I think that's still not a time to celebrate, because it's still a very tight timeline. A bit more on global warming up until now. I'm showing you here the global warming index, which is provided by University of Oxford, and here you can see the historic global warming index. And yeah, it shows a similar picture as the clock, that time is running out, our emissions are increasing, and therefore warming is also increasing. And it also shows, and what was for me a bit eye-opening, that you can see here, for example, the blue line, which is the natural delta T in the global warming index. And yeah, the natural delta T, it's not really rising, but still the combined delta T is rising. So this clearly shows the human-induced effect on global warming, at least for me. So if we are now thinking about how much carbon we would have left to spend, there have already been a lot of literature analysis on global GHG and carbon budgets. And here you need to be a bit careful, because those assessments can be quite different. Some of them report CO2 budgets, some report carbon budgets, some report equivalents, and some do not include equivalents. So that means they are not including other greenhouse gases like CH4, N2O, and so on. So here you can see some results from past analyses, and they show that concludingly we have some budget left, but it is not too high. And another message is also that we have already used up quite a bunch. If you look on the far right, that's showing what the carbon budget would be from the beginning or shortly before industrialization until 2500, and we would have used up already almost half of it. Similar analysis was done by other researchers from Mercator Institute in Germany, and they also came up with what might be the current carbon budget for 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And as you can see, and naturally, the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget is much lower. And it becomes really a pressing issue if you compare that. It's just about the last 4 years of emissions. So if you look at the last 4 years of emissions, that would eat up a 1.5 degrees carbon budget. And yeah, most of those budgets include fossil fuel sources as well as land use change emissions. Yeah, and important, as I've mentioned on the other slides, I think other GHGs should be included because they can contribute up to 33% of the budget. And yeah, as I've also mentioned, it contains uncertainties, so it's important to be aware that yeah, there are uncertainties with those budgets, and hopefully the new IPCC special reports and sixth assessment report will also bring some clarity and some certainty into those budgets. So how large is actually the challenge of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere? I've included here on the slide one of the, it's already a bit outdated. I took it from March, one of the readings from the Mauna Loa Observatory. And in March, we already had 406.72 ppm of atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And as you can see on the hockey stick graph on the right side, this is almost unprecedented in the last 800,000 years. So this really poses the questions, if we are not doing something against it, could we adapt to such high CO2 concentrations? Or what would that mean not only for human life, but also for biodiversity and other things? And it's also important to keep in mind that it's a huge challenge to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. If you just want to reduce that number by half or 1 ppm in a year, you would need to take out between 8 and 16 gigatons of CO2. So in order to discuss those challenges that lie ahead of us, the University of Oxford organized the 1.5 degrees conference. And the aims of that conference was to understand how to interpret the 1.5 degrees C target, explore options for achieving 1.5 degrees C, and also to start contributing to the evidence base of the SR 1.5, the new special report. That conference took place last September, and I attended on behalf of IEA GHG and presented a poster on our CCS and bio-CCS and negative emissions activities. So the conference started with a public lecture, and we had some very high-profile speakers, for example, Laurence Tubiana, Jonas Pastor, Nebojša Nakicenovic, and they all emphasized that there is a strong need to link the 1.5 degrees target to the available sources and things, and also that major transformations in every sector are necessary, and those transformations need to be aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, and that technology options are currently lagging behind, and because they are lagging behind, now lifestyle changes appear to be inevitable to reach 1.5 or even 2 degrees C. So, and this also then is related to the questions, how do you address environmental justice and equity related to climate change. So, so I have a couple of slides now on some food of thought directly from the sessions of this conference. So there was a a discussion whether we actually need new scenarios for 1.5 degrees or whether we should actually rather improve the existing scenarios and pathways. And we didn't find an answer to this question, but that's maybe something to pick up if you are working in this area, for example. And not only to discuss the magnitude of change, but also the rate of change. We might be able to finally adapt to a 4-degree world, but are we able to adapt it if the change happens over 10 years or over 100 years? And that's also an important question to consider. And also usually that the impacts will not start suddenly. And many communities reported, especially in the small island states, that they are already experiencing impacts. They already have rising sea levels. They already have to leave their homes behind and resettle. And yeah, this also underlines the urgency of the whole topic. And the reality check, the current Paris INDCs put us on track to a 2.7 degrees world. So we would need to come up with much more refined INDCs if we would really want to achieve 1.5 degrees. Other open questions were also the effects of overshoot, because if you overshoot, you have a quite steep increase in temperature and you have to adapt to that increase. But there's not a lot of information available how we can adapt, for example, to sharply decreasing temperatures. If we all of a sudden would take out a large chunk of CO2 of the atmosphere, for example, and would achieve a quite fast decrease in temperatures, yeah, we would need to adapt again, and that also opens further opportunities for discussions on how we can adapt. Then another reality check was that we actually have not yet achieved any significant decarbonization of the electricity, and that carbon capture and storage could enable emissions of 6 degrees C in a 4 degrees world. That would mean you could keep emitting the amount of carbon in a 6 degree scenario, but because you would capture it and store it underground, you would only have to deal with the effects of a 4 degree world. And yeah, technically CCS works and it's also safe. And zero carbon is not sufficient for 1.5 degrees C, so this would mean we would require some of the so-called negative emission technologies. And for example, bioenergy with CCS. And the assessment at that conference of the CCS and bio-CCS was that the technology works, however, that the business models, the public perception, the sustainabilities, and the lack of policies, of encouraging policies, are the main issues at the moment. Some more food for thought include that land use change will clearly be affected by mitigation, but it will also be affected if we do nothing. So sometimes I hear people say that we should rather not do bio-CCS because we then have land use change. But if we don't do bio-CCS, we will have land use change because for some other reasons. And so that's not kind of an excuse to not do bio-CCS, but rather you should think about how you can do bio-CCS sustainably. And you also have to take into account that agriculture, forestry, and land use account for around 24% of current total GHG emissions. So that's clearly a sector that needs to be tackled as well. Because calculations of some researchers at the conference showed that under a 1.5 degree C scenario, even if you do full decarbonization of all other sectors, the emissions from the agricultural sector alone would blow your carbon budget. And yeah, it was also noted that clearly consumption patterns drive those AFOLU emissions. And so that means that the demand side has a very high reduction potential for CO2 emissions and also other climate gases. So one last slide on the impressions and insights from that conference. Some researchers were present from those vulnerable countries, and they noted that they lack access to R&D funding, so that's definitely an area that can be improved. And they would also welcome to be much more engaged into the research communities in the Western countries. And there was a question whether you can have the best technology in terms of efficiency or performance, but that doesn't mean that this technology is socially acceptable. So it seems you might have to find a balance. Cost will also play into that. So the best technology might not be the most cost-effective one, but might achieve the highest emissions reductions. So that are all things that you need to consider when deciding for the mitigation portfolio. And we had some presentations from the financial sector, and they clearly stated that everything below, above 3 degrees C, they consider will have solely negative impacts on financial markets. And yeah, another thing that was highly discussed were overshoot scenarios. And some people raised the concern that those overshoot scenarios could also be a kind of an entry point to constant renegotiations, because once you say we allow overshoot of 0.5 degree, other people might say, yeah, why not do allowing 1 degree or 1.5 degrees? And yeah, and there's always of course the risk that once you overshoot, you're not coming down as quickly again as you want to. So yeah. And as I mentioned before during the slides of the carbon budgets for 1.5 are still uncertain. They are likely to be somewhere in the range of 400 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2 until 2100. So that was some preliminary data presented at the conference, but yeah, the researchers are currently validating those for the next reports. So conclusions from that conference. We have seen that the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees seems very tight. However, I have not seen any evidence presented at the conference that we cannot achieve it. If we want to achieve it, it will be really hard. We have to mainly decarbonize all sectors, not just energy, not just transport, but also agriculture. So demand side changes and lifestyle changes will be necessary as well. And we would also need more data on the so-called negative emissions and geoengineering technologies to ascertain what role they can play. And some technologies like CCS and BECCS, they are ready, and we just need to give them a chance to prove that they can achieve the anticipated reductions, and that it will be very important to integrate all of this with the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you're interested in the outputs, they have a very nice website where they have videos from the conference, the abstracts, and some further publications will also appear in a journal. So please feel free to check out this website. We will now go on to discuss a bit more how can we get to 1.5 degrees C. So this chart shows some of the RCP scenarios, the representative concentration pathways, and also the historical emissions. And you can talk a long time about this picture. I just want to make the short statement that if we want to get to negative emissions, and that is the bottom part of the chart, we would need the blue pathways, and the blue pathways almost all use negative emissions. I mean, you can also spot some that go down quite steep and then phase out and might not need it, but yeah, most of them would require larger or minor amount of negative emissions. And how negative can we get? And I will talk about that on this slide, which shows you the carbon balance of different energy systems. And you can see on the left side the fossil fuel systems. Normal fossil fuel systems usually has a positive carbon balance. You can then apply CCS, carbon capture and storage, to that system, and it will then be less positive. It will usually not be neutral because you have to expend some energy and fossil fuels to scrub the CO2 out, and that causes some residual emissions. And you're also usually capturing like 90% of the CO2, and so you again have some residual emissions. Usually renewable energy and bioenergy systems are systems that are neutral to slightly positive. Ideally they could be neutral, but we all know about real-world inefficiencies, so also usually those systems tend to be slightly positive. And special care has to be taken with bioenergy systems and indirect emissions such as from land use change. However, if you would apply to a very efficient bioenergy system carbon capture and storage, you could end up with negative emissions. That means you can actually get CO2 out of the atmosphere. So our past energy systems have all been based on the far left. And now we are entering a phase where we have more and more of those neutral technologies like wind, solar, bioenergy. The question is, should we stop at those neutral, carbon neutral technologies? And I think we really need some help from the right side, from the negative emission technologies, because we have to somehow make up for some damage done in the past, that is the historic emissions. So what are now negative emissions? There are a couple of them, and I've summarized them shortly on this slide. One is BECCS or BECCS, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And it means it uses biomass that has previously been taken up CO2 during its growth, and then you produce heat, power, or fuels, capture and store the emitted CO2. Then we've got afforestation and reforestation, where you plant trees where previously either there were none or they have been cut down. You can do direct air capture with CCS. That means you try to take the CO2 directly out of the atmosphere, which is rather challenging because of the low concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. You can do enhanced weathering or mineral carbonation, where you spread pulverized rock on land or water to take up CO2 from the atmosphere and form bicarbonate. There is soil organic carbon sequestration. We try to store soil, CO2 in the soil through advanced farming methods, through restoration measures or land creation measures. You can use biochar. That means you add burnt or torrefied biomass to the soil and to store CO2 there on a longer term. Some more debated, more like geoengineering type approaches are ocean fertilization, where you add iron or nitrogen to accelerate the uptake of CO2 by microorganisms, or cloud and ocean treatments, where you're using alkalis to wash the CO2 out of the atmosphere, or you use lime to absorb CO2 from the oceans. And this slide shows you the concept of different nets. I won't take too much time here, just for your reference later, that you can see what or how do the different negative emission technologies shift the CO2 or take the CO2 from. And it's more to show that some of them are able to achieve real negative emissions compared to fossil fuel energy, where you just take out from the geosphere and put the CO2 in the atmosphere and then it stays there. If you would do CCS, you would just try to return the CO2 back into the geosphere. And for example, bioenergy is a means where you can actually take out some part of the CO2 in the atmosphere and return it to the land. And then if you store it with CCS, you can actually put it away into the geosphere. So how do those negative emission technologies now compare in terms of their potential for CO2 reduction? And I've summarized that on this slide. The size of the bubbles is not totally comparable, but I tried to get at least the perspective on the relations. And we have seen earlier that the required negative emissions for 1.5 degrees might be around 500 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2. So if we would start now, that would be around 6 to 12 gigatons of CO2 per year that we would need to do. And you can see that BECCS is among the higher end, and peer-reviewed published papers have shown it might be able to achieve somewhere between 3.5 till up to 20 gigatons of CO2 a year. Soil organic carbon sequestration, afforestation, reforestation, and direct air capture are thought to achieve a bit lower, but still significant chunks of that rate. And enhanced weathering seems to be more limited, which should not mean that we should not consider it, but just to get the perspective, it might not be able to achieve those large-scale reductions as, for example, BECCS. So with nets, there come some trade-offs, and I've summarized here on this slide what I think are the most important ones. That's their energy demand, their water demand, their land demand, their impact on soil, their impact on albedo, and the costs, of course. And one important thing that I recently read about in a paper was that a lot of people advocate for afforestation, reforestation, because planting a tree is always good. Is there anything negative for planting a tree? Yes, there can if you do it wrong, because it depends which type of tree species do you plant in which part of the world. And the studies have shown that if you do a large-scale afforestation in the tropics, it can be good. You have a net global cooling. However, if you do it in the temperate or boreal regions, it might backfire and you might end up with a net warming effect. And that's because different tree species are different in terms of how much carbon they store, how much sunlight they reflect, and also how much evaporative cooling they cause. So it's important to really look which type of afforestation makes sense in which area, and not to just blindly. Of course, trees also have other ecosystem benefits, such as filtering the air. So, but still, if you just consider the global warming effect, it might not always be the best option. And this slide from Smith et al. Shows you the resource demand of some of the nets in comparison, and it compares BECCS, afforestation, reforestation, enhanced weathering, and direct air capture. And you can see, and one thing that's always mentioned with regards to BECCS is it has a high land requirement. But you can also see that afforestation, reforestation has at least the same, if not a higher, land requirement than BECCS. And also afforestation, reforestation, and BECCS have a really high freshwater requirement. So just to provide a bit of a perspective before we are now focusing a bit more on one of those negative emission technologies on which we have been working for quite some time, that is BECCS. And yeah, just a slide to remind you of the concept. And we've also already done a webinar on BECCS, and if you're interested, you can watch that as a recording. And with regards to BECCS, it's interesting to see how much it could contribute. And in this slide from the IEA and showing how it could fit into the 2DS, you can see that bioenergy provides around 10% and CCS around 12% of cumulative emissions reductions up to 2050. And bio-CCS alone could account for 2% of the cumulative emissions reductions. And if you rather want to look at that, how much gigaton of CO2 that can be, it's in 2050 it could be almost 1 gigaton of CO2 linked to BECCS, which would then represent around 16% of the total CCS capacity. So where we are with BECCS now, there have been many studies done on BECCS and CCS, and most of them conclude that the components are technically feasible. And the interesting thing with BECCS is kind of perceived double benefits. So you have the negative emissions, but you also produce heat and power as a sellable product. There are currently 5 operating BECCS projects with a capacity of around 0.1 to 1 megatons per year. And issues are with the accounting side, because GHG accounting schemes, there are only a couple of them that actually cover BECCS, so there's still room for improvement. And also research on the public perception of CCS. There exists a lot, but there's very limited research and it's contradictory on BECCS. And some of the main drivers for BECCS are usually CO2 price, natural gas price, the infrastructure, availability of clustering options, the sustainability of the feedstock, and the public perception. So maybe one of the milestone projects, you might have heard about this, is the Illinois Industrial CCS project. And this project has now started operating again. It has a first phase. Then they were closing down for some months or even years to overhaul the facilities, get their extended permit, and they are now up and running again, storing 1 million tons of CO2 over 5 years, and it is stored in a sandstone formation. So when you consider bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, it's important to see it in the nexus context, and that means that the action in one of these areas you see here will have a reaction in the other areas. And this is especially so for BECCS because it brings the bioenergy component into the picture. So some of the main concerns include the competition between food and bioenergy crops, the shift of emissions from one sector to the other, also known as carbon leakage, the impact of large-scale biomass infrastructure and supply chains, the impact of climate change on crop yields, what is the water footprint of the BECCS systems, there might be increased fertilizer use and what effect will that have, and of course the emissions from the land use change itself, and also how sustainable can we produce biomass. So as I said, land use change, it's a big issue, and there are 2 forms, indirect and direct land use change. I won't go into the details here, just that direct land use change can be measured quite accurately. The problem lies more with the indirect land use change. And although we are aware of this topic, we might still put that into a picture on how much land are we currently using and how much would we need for BECCS in a worst and best case scenario. So you can see that here we are currently using 3,315 million hectares of pasture and 1,585 million hectares of cropland. And energy crops needed in a low scenario would be around 380, and energy crops needed in a high scenario around 990 million hectares. So that's just to put this into perspective. We also have some means to overcome the lack of land. That would be, as we mentioned, or as the 1.5 degrees conference highlighted, the demand side changes, yield increases, and also to use marginal lands. And I've put the numbers here. Marginal lands, the assessments of those are quite uncertain, and they could be anywhere between 400 and 1,000 million hectares. But some of them exist now, available, and could be used for BECCS. One other thing to think about is food resource intensity. So you see here that there are certain food items that are quite land extensive, but also freshwater and GHG emissions intensive. So that provides a lot of scope for tackling the demand side mitigation options. And another thing what we could also do, we currently produce a lot of food waste. So the current food waste is around 1.3 billion tons. That's over a third of what we produce in total. And the land area associated with that food waste is 1,400 million hectares. If you remember 2 slides ago, best case BECCS scenario would need 990. So we could maybe cover that if we would just reduce our food waste. And with that food waste comes a carbon footprint. That's 3.3 gigatons of CO2. So if you would tackle that, we would only save those emissions, so a double benefit. So now quickly onto the IPCC special report on 1.5. It has a rather long title, and I've put it up here if you want to have the full title. In short, we will just refer to it as the SR 1.5. They're also preparing other special reports. That's one on oceans and the cryosphere, the SROCC, and the SR2 that will include assessment of desertification, land degradation, sustainable land management, food security, greenhouse gas fluxes, and so on. And all those three special reports will be input reports for the new sixth assessment report. So here's the outline, and I've underlined those where there might be a special special places to consider negative emission technologies like BECCS. And it will discuss mitigation pathways that are compatible with 1.5 in the context of sustainable development. It will also investigate the global responses to the threat of climate change and also the approaches, and that might be the main chapter, to implementing that global response to the threat of climate change. And they have quite a tough timeline. And you can see that here. So the urgency of the issue is also reflected somehow in that timeline. And the call for author nominations already closed in November last year. And if you have any new research that you want to have considered by the authors, it must be more or less published now or in the next few weeks or months. And I think there's still possibility, if you want to be engaged as a kind of expert reviewer, you can still be nominated by your local entry organization to put yourself up as reviewers. And then, yeah, in October 2018, which is in a bit more than a year, then 1.5 years, then we already expect the report to be ready and published. So overall conclusions from this webinar: due to the quick erosion of the remaining carbon budget for a 1.5 degree scenario, timely action is now really required. We have seen that CCS technology components are mature and that CCS could enable continued access to fossil fuels in carbon-constrained scenarios. We've also seen that negative emission technologies, for example bioenergy with CCS, could make up for the residual as well as historic emissions. Maybe the best bet that we have is a varied mitigation portfolio, because each of the nets has its pros and cons, and so it might be more about applying the suitable technology in the right place and not in ruling out any technologies that we might need. And what's really important is that a whole systems approach is required. We have seen all the interlinks in the food, water, energy, climate nexus, and yeah, this means we really need to have a whole systems approach. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, close my presentation, and if you have any questions, I will be happy to try and answer them.
Okay, Jasmine, thank you. Wonderfully clear presentation as usual. I got some points of clarification, one quite fundamental, which came up quite early on, which is what do you actually mean by a carbon budget, or by the carbon budget?
Yeah, as I said, yeah, usually everyone's talking about carbon budgets. If you go to certain reports and journal articles, you have to be very careful what the authors actually understand under the carbon budget. As I've said, some include only CO2 emissions, some include CO2 equivalents, which will mean CO2 plus the Kyoto gases like methane and nitrous oxide and stuff. Yeah. And also some confusion might arise in numbers, because some researchers prefer to report gigatons of carbon and some gigatons of CO2. So that might also, you might be careful if you want to compare numbers. Yeah.
I've got some other questions on clarification. You made a statement about zero carbon earlier on in your presentation, the need for zero carbon. They were asking, were you just relating that to the electricity sector, or is that more broad? Were you relating that more broadly?
In my opinion, it would need to be related a bit more broadly. I mean, it's fine to have to try to decarbonize the electricity sector, but we also know that we need to work on the industrial sectors. Heat is also one option. Yeah, and also, as I mentioned, the agricultural sector really needs to be, efforts need to be rolled out across all sectors. Because if we want to go as low as 1.5, we will not be able to do it by just focusing on one sector.
An earlier point of clarification as well was one of your early slides that you're talking about the natural warming.
Yep.
There was a question there, can you further explain what the delta T in the natural warming is?
This graph shows, maybe I'm not sure if I can go back here and yeah, maybe I'll just quickly go back. It was very at the beginning. Yeah, this one. I mean, what you here see in black is the monthly observations, and let me just see. And those are taken from the head scrub model, and this is the data set of the monthly instrumental temperature records, and they combine the sea surface temperature records from the Hadley Centre of the UK Met Office and the land surface air temperature records combined by the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia. And so you have the monthly observations, and then you have what is the red line, which is the combined temperature change. And this is kind of broken down into the orange and the blue one, which is the orange, the human-induced delta T, and the blue one is the natural delta T. So it's more to show we observe the relative warming relative to the reference period of 1861 and 1880, and then we try to really break down how much do we think is human-induced and how much is natural. And what I find quite striking is that the human-induced one is steadily rising, and the natural one also had periods of relative cooling. And this is even more shocking. So although we had recently had some periods where we had some natural cooling effects, for example, I think in the 1990s there was a volcanic eruption in the Philippines, the Mount Pinatubo, and that caused quite some, as you see here, up to almost 0.2 degrees C cooling effect. But our activities have more than outweighed that cooling effect. So if you want to have more information on that, you can go to Global Warming Index.org, and they explain that graph in much more detail there.
Thank you, Yasmin. The questions are now coming in thick and fast. Quite a emotive comment or a margin issue at JHGT was, what do you think of the CO2 utilisation to make hydrocarbon chemicals and plastics?
I think if you have an industrial clusters where some industries have technologies that need CO2 as an input, that's fine. Then you can use as much or dump as much there into the projects as you can or want. I think just the total amount of CO2 that you can bring in those products is much, much smaller than what you could achieve with technologies like CCS or bio-CCS. It might help to change the perception of products for them to become more green, also with the danger then of greenwashing, because you just have those smaller benefits. And yeah, so you can do it where it makes sense. but you have to be careful that you don't let yourself distract too much, because it would be dangerous if you think you can solve a climate change just by making CO2-based products. And you have to consider they have a lifetime, and after that lifetime, the CO2 might be up in the atmosphere. The plastic might go to an incinerator. If the incinerator, like Clemetsrud now, has CCS, then that's fine, and that's even better. But people might throw it away, or it ends up in the ocean. So it has its own problems, but
Another one, where does the research stand for bioenergy with algae?
Bioenergy with algae, that's one topic, and I've recently done a webinar, maybe not so recently, I think it was from the IEA Bioenergy Implementing Agreement, or now TCP. And they have a very, very nice overview report on algae technologies. And they are lagging behind, and they might offer some opportunities, but they have their own issues and challenges, and it's not something that is as ready as conventional CCS or co-firing of biomass at the moment. But if the person wants to get in touch, I can send that information on that.
Thank you. If you send us an email, then we'll contact we'll like that. I've got another reflection on a point regarding your comments on the 1.5 degrees 1.5 degrees centigrade conference. You made a comment that 3 degrees C rise is negative, has negative impacts on the financial markets. I think it's a bit of a fundamental question here, but why did anybody in the financial sector state why they were still not taking climate impact seriously and investing major infrastructure on coastal lands?
No, I'm not aware that they made a statement about that. No, it was just one or two persons from the financial sector, you must admit. But
and we had some questions relating to cost. I mean, one was asking about cost on supercritical boilers, subcritical boilers of CCS. I mean, we wouldn't advocate putting CCS on subcritical boilers. It would be high cost, and the efficiency losses would be too great, so we wouldn't consider that. Do we have a cost for dollars a ton for BECCS on?
It's similar to CCS. It's slightly marginally higher because it's a bit less mature. But it's there are different numbers, and I've done that review paper on BECCS, and at that time it was anywhere between $45 and maybe $200 per ton. It really depends on the technology. BECCS is such a varied field. What you can do BECCS on ethanol fermentation, you can do it in pulp and paper mills, you can just do co-combustion, you can do gasification, you can do biomethane production. So it's such a varied thing that it's hard to come up with like the standard number for BECCS.
I recall we've just done a report on looking at CCS and a craft pulp mill in Finland, and that's coming out at about $65 a ton. So that looks really reasonable because of the scale.
Similar to ethanol.
Somebody followed up his earlier question saying the making of fuels utilising CO, that would take a lot of CO2, wouldn't it? Well, in the world,
not that much.
No, we don't think it will take up that much.
It will be maximum maybe 5% of the emissions reductions we have to do. I mean, it's good to do it if you have the opportunity, and then that's fine.
And it also needs a lot of energy as well. So the energy balance doesn't always stand up. And there's been a lot of talk about using free renewable energy, particularly in Europe. And if you're overproducing electricity, the market at some point will regulate itself, and I think free electricity will disappear. But it's almost like expecting subsidies. I think we're getting to the point where we'll call it a day. There are some questions that we haven't answered on here, so we'll endeavour to answer those by posting on the website. Thank you very much, Jasmine. Thank you all those that have commented or asked questions. I've had several very, very positive comments about the presentation, about its clarity and how informative it was. So once again, Jasmine, thank you very much indeed.
It was hard to get. I mean, it's a very large, complex topic. You could talk about that for hours.
Well, maybe we'll get you back to talk about it for another couple of hours another time. But Thank you, Jasmine, and at that point we'll call it a day. Sean, have you got any points you want to add about the posting of the YouTube video?
We will post the recording of this webinar within the next hour, and I'll email everybody a link as soon as it's done and it's ready. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jasmine.
Good afternoon.